What's going on, everyone? TM24 here, and we are back with some more Marvel Snap content. Now, if you're just now finding the channel, welcome. I hope you find the video informative and entertaining. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you for your continued support. I appreciate it. My llama here appreciates it. But today, we're going to be talking about Conquest, and specifically 3 decks with different variations of those decks that will help you perform better in Conquest. So let's get right into this. First one we are going to talk about is High Evolutionary. Well, I guess what we should first talk about is what are we looking for in a deck for Conquest. So you're going to be playing the same person 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 times or more throughout one sitting. So what that means is that they're going to get to know your deck, you're going to get to know their deck. So what do you want out of your deck? What I think you should look for is a deck that has consistency, deck that has multiple play lines, or let's say ways to win, and something that isn't easily counterable. So for instance, I don't know if Patriot Cerebro style decks, Galactus style decks are a good deck to bring to Conquest, simply because one card could counter your whole game plan. So ideally you want to be more flexible than that. And High Evolutionary, specifically this lockdown deck, is great at that. Flexibility and, giving you multiple ways to win. So, looking at this deck, we obviously are using High Evolutionary as our base. We're using Wasp, Misty Knight, Cyclops, Thing, Abomination, and the Hulk. So the only one we're not using there is the Shocker. But, the big pieces of this deck really come in the form of Storm, Spider-Man, and Professor X. This is the lockdown version, so we're trying to get ahead, lock them out of a lane, and secure that lane, or lock them out of a lane that's uncontested so that we can secure that on turn 6. We've got 2 huge sources of power in Abomination and the Hulk. If you guys have seen any High Evolutionary gameplay or decks, this is a pretty standard list. Really strong, I like it, but there are a couple of changes that I would make. First off, what I would do, especially because we have Storm and Spider-Man in this list, I would go for a different 6-drop here. I'm going to keep Hulk because we may want that huge drop of power, but what I would probably change is take Misty Knight out, and instead, let's pop Dr. Doom in. Now, the reason that we want to do that is because if we can lock out a location through one of those two, it gives us the chance to still put power there through Dr. Doom's Doom bots. So I think that is huge. I think this is a great addition for losing just Misty Knight. But there is another way that you could go. Now, High Evolutionary is super popular, and there are a lot of effects that reduce your power. So you want to have an answer to that, especially in Conquest. If they have an answer to yours and you don't to theirs, you're going to be in big trouble. So you can take this deck a completely different way. I know it's going to look weird, but you're going to want to hear me out on this. We're going to get rid of Hulk, and we're going to get rid of Abomination. Now, I know those are 2 huge sources of power, but we're not going to rely on single dumps there, and we're going to go wider. So instead, what we want to add, we're going to add Misty Knight back, because she is going to work great in this deck, allowing us to power up some of our smaller cards. And like I said, we don't want to be hit by High Evolutionary and not have an answer. And that's where Luke Cage comes in. He's going to keep all of our stuff nice and healthy, where theirs is hopefully going to start taking some hits from our cards. So I like this list because it is cheap, so you can go a bit wider. You can still get a bunch of power to all 3 locations through Dr. Doom, and then you still have ways to lock out with Professor X, Spider-Man, and of course Storm. Now, one way this deck would struggle is we are a little bit heavy on 3-drops. A lot of our power can come from Sunspot and Nebula, and that can be a problem simply because of things like Killmonger. A lot of people are running Sarah-style decks. Spoiler alert, Sarah's going to be one of the next decks that we talk about. So a lot of people are running Killmonger. So we need a way to protect those cards. So another card you should consider, of course, is Armor. Using him to protect some of these 1-drops. And it really depends on what route you want to go. Maybe you give up Storm prefer armor. I kind of like that inclusion. We keep only 1 3-drop, so our deck still stays super cheap, allowing us to go wide. You could stack a Sunspot, armor, and a Nebula in one lane, and you're gonna feel really strong about that lane. Especially if a 5-power Doombot is there buffing it, helping that lane at the end. So that's one other card that I would consider for these high evolutionary type decks. But high evolutionary, because of consistency, because of such a strong base, is going to be a type of deck that is going to do really well in Conquest. But the next one we're talking about, and I mentioned it briefly, was Serra. Serra control decks are super flexible. You can win a number of different ways. You can take out your opponent's huge threats. You can take out, those 1-drops that we were just talking about. You can win through power of your own in the form of Bishop, Angela, Hitmonkey, all of them getting to high levels of power. And all of it can be made cheap thanks to Serra. So her decks are going to do extremely well. Kitty Pryde, another huge source of power, continually buffing up things like Angela and Bishop. So Serra control decks are going to make a ton of sense. Shang-Chi can counter those Abominations and those Hulks and things like that. So she's going to do really, really well. This is the standard Serra control deck. This is the one that I've talked about multiple times on this channel that, hey, if you can learn one deck and learn it well, this would be a really good one to learn, simply because it's always going to be around because of its flexibility, because of its consistency, because it's just a strong deck. It has a lot of answers, and typically it can make its way thanks to cards like Scarlet Witch. You can get rid of some of those locations you otherwise can't reach. So this standard list is going to be really, really strong. Now, from my own experience, I've been running into a different list, and that list is actually, we're going to build right now in front of you. They cut all of these 2-drops. They cut Bishop, and they cut both Shang-Chi and Enchantress. So you're starting with Kitty Pryde, Nova, and Killmonger, and then there's only one other cost card that they've been playing. Well, 2. I almost forgot about one, but I'll show you the 2-drop at the end. But they're going with a bunch of 3-drops, right? They're playing Silver Surfer, they're playing Juggernaut, they're playing Storm. We've already got Killmonger in there. They're playing Brood, they're playing Maximus, they're playing Polaris a lot of the times, and this is pretty much the standard list that they're playing. Oh, and they're playing Mr. Fantastic. The only other card that I see being included in this list comes in the form of Goose. So another super strong Serra deck that is going to do well in Conquest, because you're not relying on one way to win. So how do we win this? We've got power through Kitty Pryde. We've got answers to our opponent's power while making sure ours stays strong, and it even buffs our other cards. Goose is a really nice inclusion in this list because all of our cards except for Serra can be played on a Goose lane, really making it tough for our opponent to keep up. Brood, locations like Death's Domain, not gonna hurt as bad because we are able to get in there with those Broodlings. We are able to buff pretty much our whole board thanks to Silver Surfer. We can storm a lane and then follow up with the Juggernaut to secure that lane. And then we've just got power in Polaris, which also has disruption. And then Maximus, whose 7 power is really strong when you're dropping 7, plus a Surfer, plus, a Killmonger on turn 6. It just is insane. So this list, again, is really, really strong and is going to do well in those Conquest type games. They can get to know it, but you can continue to win other ways. So another list that I really, really like. And then we've got one more deck, and it's going to be a bounce style deck. So this is your standard bounce deck, which I think is very strong, but there's a couple cards in here that I particularly am not so fond of, so I would cut, but we'll talk about that in a second. So of course, this deck is going to utilize Falcon and Beast to get some of these high value cards back to our hand, allowing us to really power up things like Angela and Bishop. Now, the reason I really like this deck is because it's really tough for your opponent to get a read on where all your power is going to be. Just because you play an Angela and a Bishop in the center lane doesn't mean that's where they're going to wind up. Beast can come through and you can put them in separate lanes or just move all your power somewhere else. So for that reason, it makes it tough for your opponent to beat you. Yes, they can come up with a plan, but if they never know where your power is going to land until turn 5, it can be really tough for them to win. They've got to worry about each location. And we can still have huge pop-off turns thanks to things like Hit Monkey, Mysterio, and then a huge Kitty Pryde and a Demon on 6 is just absolutely insane. So I really like this list. I think it's really consistent. Chavez helps with that because she provides the consistent draw and a 9 power if you want to go that route. Typically, it's not worth going that route. You'd rather play multiple cards, but you do have the option. The other card that I don't particularly like in this list is Collector. Now, I see why, right? We've got Kitty Pryde, we've got Falcon, and we've got Beast, bringing cards back to our hand. But on 2, it kind of feels... It just doesn't feel like Collector feels like a good play to me. So instead, I would go a different route here. Now, we could take out the Collector, we could take out Chavez, and then there's one more card that we've got to lose out of this list, and it can be tough to decide which one. Sometimes it's Iceman, sometimes it's Mysterio, but the way that I see this list playing, a little bit differently. We're going to add Korg. He's additional disruption, and then, of course, if we're adding Korg, we're throwing rocks in. We're going to add Darkhawk. Now, Darkhawk's going to be your big source of power, kind of like Chavez was. Doesn't have the consistent draw, but Darkhawk can definitely be a better play than Chavez, especially if he's coming down alongside a Kitty Pryde or a Demon, something like that. It can be a lot more power. Now, like I said, there's one other card that we would typically like to include in this list, and it's Black Widow. So we just have to pick a spot to kind of take her out. And like I said, maybe it's Mysterio, maybe it's Iceman, but we're going to add Black Widow to this list and, utilize stopping our opponent from drawing cards. Can be super frustrating in Conquest, and definitely a good strategy to help keep your Darkhawk strong. So this is kind of a Darkhawk bounce list. I think it's great. Yes, it's a little bit less consistent, but it feels like you can put more power out there, so it's got more potential. Now, these have been the 3 decks that I have used and performed well with in Conquest and think that are going to consistently perform well, just because of the flexibility, because of the way that you can change game plans, you can win different ways, and they're just good decks. They are genuinely just good decks. They have answers, they have power, they have, you can go wide, you can go tall. You can kind of do it all with these decks. So if you've got a shot to try these in Conquest, I say do it. I think you will definitely have a much easier time than something like a Galactus deck or a Patriot deck or anything like that. These are a bit more consistent, and they just seem to perform well. And if you guys have hung around till now, I do really appreciate you guys doing so. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and hit that subscribe and like button, as it really does help me out. But give these a shot in Conquest and let me know how they do. And until next time, have some fun.